It began with a sentence that should never have been spoken aloud. Is this some kind of joke? That arrogant question, thrown toward an old man sitting quietly on a folding chair, would ignite one of the most shocking public humiliations, reversals of power, and revelations of forgotten heroism ever seen on a United States Marine Corps base. Inside the open house tent, among families and visitors moving through historical displays, sat Harold Winters, 89 years old, faded polo shirt, khaki pants, hands resting calmly on his knees. To most eyes, he was unremarkable, another elderly man enjoying the event. But to fate, he was the spark waiting for the wrong match. Corporal Davis, 21 years and 6 months in age, stood over him with the sharp ego of someone who believed authority and wisdom were the same thing. His uniform was crisp, his posture stiff with pride, his voice cutting through the quiet as he barked, "Hey, I am talking to you, old man." Behind him, 2 young Marines echoed his arrogance with mocking grins, their presence turning disrespect into spectacle. Harold did not react. His gaze rested somewhere beyond the tent wall, calm and steady, which only fueled the corporal's irritation. "This area is for active duty personnel and families. You get lost on the way to the bingo hall?" The insult rippled through nearby civilians. Conversation stopped and unease spread, but no one stepped forward. Davis mistook silence for approval. He puffed his chest and demanded identification, believing himself the guardian of a space he barely understood. Harold moved slowly, reaching into his worn leather wallet, fingers stiff with age. As he searched for his identification card, Davis sighed loudly. "Come on, Grandpa. What are you, 100? Just show me your driver's license so I can call you a cab." Harold handed over his state-issued identification card without a word. Davis snatched it, barely glancing at it. "Harold Winters, Northwood resident. Not enough to give you clearance," he declared, holding the card like something soiled. Then he noticed the small tarnished pin on Harold's collar and sneered. "What is that supposed to be? A prize for finishing your oatmeal?" His friends laughed loudly, sharp and cruel, while the bystanders fell into tense silence. For the first time, something shifted on Harold's face. Not fear, not anger, something older, deeper, a memory rising like smoke from a long-extinguished fire. His eyes drifted not to Davis, not to the tent, but far away. In his mind, warmth vanished, replaced by a cold so brutal it cut like glass. In a heartbeat, the 89-year-old man was gone, replaced by a 20-year-old Marine standing in the frozen hills of North Korea. The air was iron gray, the wind howled. Artillery rumbled in the distance. He was kneeling beside his dying platoon leader, Captain Richards, whose trembling hand pressed a jagged metal pin shaped from a shattered radio antenna into Harold's palm. "You held the line, Winters. Do not ever forget what we did here," the captain rasped. The memory flashed and vanished. Harold blinked. The tent returned. The laughter returned. The corporal stood over him, completely unaware that he had just mocked an object, soaked in blood, sacrifice, and history. And yet the worst moment had not even arrived, because just as Harold's eyes began to shift cold, distant, remembering the battlefield, a presence entered the tent. A presence that would change everything and expose a truth that would leave the entire crowd stunned. Harold's breath steadied as the memory faded, but Corporal Davis was too absorbed in his own authority to notice the shift. He waved the old man's identification card between 2 fingers and said, "All right, Harold, Winters of Northwood. This does not explain why you are in a restricted tent." His voice carried enough volume to reassure himself, not the crowd. Several civilians watched now with a mixture of anger and disbelief. They saw a young Marine trying to impress his peers at the expense of a defenseless man. Yet no one dared challenge someone in uniform. The air thickened with a familiar modern tension. People who wanted to speak, but feared the consequences of speaking. Davis puffed out his chest again, leaning closer to Harold. "You are acting suspicious. That silence of yours is not helping," he pressed. Harold simply folded his hands and looked at him with a calmness that felt ancient, almost unsettling, as if he had stood before far worse men than this. One of the younger Marines behind Davis nudged him and laughed. "Ask him if he wandered in from the retirement home. Their cruelty was juvenile, but it struck deeply because it came from a place where youth meets ignorance. None of them had lived long enough to understand how fragile dignity becomes with age." Davis gestured toward the tarnished pin on Harold's collar. "And what is this? That little toy supposed to mean something?" His tone dripped with mockery, as if the pin were an afterthought. A cheap accessory someone might buy from a thrift store. It was the kind of insult born from ignorance so profound it bordered on dangerous. Harold stared down at the pin, and his fingers twitched, not from fear but from memory. That small piece of metal, jagged, bent, unpolished, held the dying breath of Captain Richards and the ghost of a battlefield frozen in time. The crowd couldn't have known it, but the weight of that pin had outlived generations. As Davis mocked it, something inside Harold shifted again. He felt a cold wind brush, the inside of his chest so real he could almost smell the gunpowder and taste the metallic tang of blood in the air. But he blinked, steadying himself, refusing to let the past swallow him too deeply in front of these people. Davis, mistaking Harold's silence for weakness, pushed harder. "I am calling the military police," he announced loudly. "We cannot have random civilians wandering around restricted areas, especially confused ones." His voice carried across the tent, drawing even more eyes onto the scene. A few people murmured to one another. Someone shook their head. A father whispered to his teenage son, "This is not how you treat people." But still, no one intervened. That was the strange power of a uniform. It could silence even those who recognized abuse. Harold looked up at the corporal with eyes that were pale, clear, and painfully steady. There was no plea in them, no fear, only the quiet endurance of someone who had suffered worse humiliations in places far colder and far deadlier. Davis, blinded by his own ego, interpreted that calmness as defiance. "Do not stare at me like that," he snapped. "You are making this worse for yourself." His friends snickered again, feeding off the confrontation like spectators cheering a schoolyard fight. It was a spectacle, cheap and cruel, unfolding in a space meant to honor history. As Davis held Harold's identification card, a new voice cut through the heavy air. Corporal Davis. The tone was not loud, but it carried weight, the voice of someone who chose his words carefully because he had earned the right to. Gunnery Sergeant Reyes stepped forward, his expression calm but hardening by the second. Reyes was in his late 30s, his uniform worn with the subtle imperfections that come from real experience. His eyes took in the scene in one sweep. The embarrassed crowd, the arrogant corporal, the unmoving elderly man, and the pin small, dull, overlooked. Nothing about the moment felt right to him. "Is this man giving you any trouble, sir?" Reyes asked Harold directly, his tone respectful, steady. Before Harold could answer, Davis stepped between them like a territorial dog. "Gunny, I have this under control. This individual is trespassing and refusing to cooperate." Reyes' jaw tightened. He had seen this type of arrogance before, usually in new recruits who mistook volume for leadership. His eyes flicked to Harold again, and for a moment he studied the old man's posture, the stillness, the odd sense of gravity around him. Reyes did not know Harold Winters, but he sensed something was off. "Corporal, step back," Reyes ordered, voice quiet but firm. "Now." Davis stiffened. "With all due respect, Gunnery Sergeant, base security is my responsibility at this station. I am handling it." His words were technically correct, but delivered with a tone that crossed the line into insubordination. Reyes felt a spark of anger flicker, but he pushed it down. He glanced at the two young Marines behind Davis. Their smirks vanished instantly when Reyes raised an eyebrow. They suddenly looked very interested in the ground beneath their boots. Reyes shifted his attention back to Harold. "Sir, may I ask your name?" he asked gently. Davis rolled his eyes. "Gunny, I already checked his identification. Harold Winters of Northwood. Nothing to see here." But Reyes held out his hand anyway. Harold nodded and handed him the identification card. The moment Reyes saw the birth year, his brows lifted slightly, not in disbelief, but in respect. 89 years old. That alone commanded more dignity than Davis had offered in the past 10 minutes. Reyes' gaze then drifted to the small tarnished pin. He didn't recognize it, but something about the way Harold wore it, small, close, careful, told him it was not a trinket. It was a memory made solid. Reyes stepped back slightly, opening space around himself before he made his decision. If he confronted Davis directly, the situation would explode. If he walked away, the humiliation would get worse. So he did what experienced Marines do. He acted quietly, but decisively. He pulled his phone from his pocket, turned away from everyone, and dialed the base command post. "This is Gunnery Sergeant Reyes at the historical exhibit tent," he said softly. "We have an escalating situation. Corporal Davis is harassing an elderly civilian." It paused, listening. "The civilian's name is Harold Winters." "Yes, Winters. Harold." Reyes turned back toward the scene, watching Davis pace in front of Harold like a guard dog who didn't know what he was guarding. Then, on the other end of the line, something changed. Reyes heard the operator's voice sharpen. Another voice came on the line, more urgent, more authoritative. "Gunny, hold your position. Do not let Mr. Winters leave. We are sending someone immediately." Reyes frowned. Copy that. Who exactly is... But the reply hit him like a physical blow. The base commandant is already on his way. Reyes slowly lowered the phone, eyes fixed on Harold Winters with new understanding, new fear, and new urgency. Something enormous had just been set in motion, something far bigger than the corporal realized. And at that exact moment, outside the tent, faint sirens began to rise in the distance. The sirens grew louder, a rising wail that didn't match the situation Davis believed he was handling. He stood with his arms crossed, savoring what he thought was the arrival of a simple patrol to correct an elderly intruder. The crowd turned toward the tent entrance, the tension sharpening as everyone sensed something bigger approaching everyone except the corporal who still believed he was right. Gunnery Sergeant Reyes kept his distance, eyes darting between Harold and the approaching shadows moving outside the tent. He knew the sound of a normal military police response, and this wasn't it. This was a convoy. That kind of deployment didn't come from minor disturbances or confused civilians. Harold remained still, hands folded, eyes lowered, as though bracing himself for memories rather than events. His shoulders carried the heaviness of someone who had stood between life and death too many times to fear anything that uniforms could bring. The pin on his collar, dull, worn, silent, caught the faintest glint of light. Davis, oblivious, moved closer and raised his voice. "You see, old man? This is what happens when you refuse to cooperate. They are going to deal with this." His tone carried triumph, the pride of someone who believed authority belonged to youth and volume, not sacrifice or history. One of the Marines behind him whispered, "Corporal, that sounds like multiple vehicles." Davis snapped, "So what?" They probably had nothing else to do. The crowd exchanged glances. Even the civilians could sense the arrival was far too large for an elderly man sitting quietly on a chair. The sirens stopped abruptly. Doors slammed. Boots hit the ground in synchronized patterns. The rhythm alone made several people straighten their posture. Harold's eyelids fluttered just once, as though the sound tapped an old nerve. A memory cracked open inside him. Not because of fear, but because noise like that belonged to urgent moments he had lived through in places where the temperature was 40 degrees below zero. For a brief second, Harold wasn't in a tent. He was in Korea again, kneeling in snow that swallowed his boots. His breath hung like fog as he stared at the jagged metal pin in his hand, the same pin now resting on his collar. Captain Richards lay next to him, gasping for air, telling him not to forget what they did there, telling him the cost of holding the line. The cold had bitten through his gloves. Blood had soaked into the snow where men he knew lay lifeless. It was a memory that lived quietly until arrogance poked it awake. Harold blinked, returning to the tent just as the entrance flap burst open. 2 military police officers stepped in first, their expressions severe, hands near their holsters. They scanned the room, then moved aside. The crowd gasped softly, a ripple of shock passing through them as a man stepped inside. It was Major General Marcus Thorne, base commandant, 2-star rank displayed cleanly across his chest. His presence shifted the entire atmosphere. Conversations died instantly, phones lowered, and a visible current of formality ripped through the tent. Even civilians felt it. Davis stared, his confidence evaporating. His jaw tightened, then loosened. "General Thorne?" he whispered, throat going dry. The general didn't look at him. His eyes swept the tent once sharp, cold, assessing before locking onto Harold. The path between them seemed to open naturally as people stepped aside. Thorne walked forward with precise, controlled strides, his expression carved in stone. He stopped exactly 3 feet from Harold Winters. Harold began to rise slowly from his chair, knees stiff, hands gripping the armrests. The general raised a hand. "Do not get up on my account, Sergeant Major," he said, voice steady and full, and the title echoed through the tent like a shockwave. The old man froze mid-motion. The crowd inhaled sharply. Davis paled, the blood draining from his face as the realization formed Sergeant Major. The words hit him like a physical strike. Major General Thorne planted his heels together, straightened his back, and delivered a sharp, flawless salute, one so crisp and reverent it seemed to slice through the air. He held it, eyes fixed on Harold with a mixture of respect and gravity rarely seen outside a memorial. The tent was silent, utterly silent. Respect filled the space where ignorance had been only moments earlier. Davis swallowed hard, stepping back as though the weight of his mistake pressed onto his chest. His friends stiffened, their earlier amusement erased completely. No one moved, no one breathed loudly. The transformation from humiliation to honor was so sudden it felt unreal. Major General Thorne dropped his salute only after Harold gave the smallest nod. Then he faced the civilians, the Marines, and finally the trembling corporal. His voice carried the weight of a man who had memorized history and seen real service. "You all stand in the presence of Sergeant Major Harold Winters of the 1st Marine Division," he announced. "Veteran of the Second World War. Veteran of the Korean War. Veteran of the Vietnam War." The emphasis on each conflict felt like a hammer striking stone. He didn't need theatrics. His voice alone reshaped the room. At the Battle of the Chosin Reservoir in the winter of 1950, then Staff Sergeant Winters held a line that should have been impossible to hold. Outnumbered 20-1, temperatures 40 degrees below zero, machine gun frozen, officer dead. His stare shifted toward Davis, each word slicing deeper. And he held it alone. A woman in the audience covered her mouth. A man in a Vietnam veteran cap slowly rose to his feet. Even the children sensed something enormous beneath the words. Thorne continued. Armed only with his entrenching tool and 6 grenades, he charged the enemy and broke their assault. He held the line for 17 hours until reinforcements arrived. He is credited with saving the lives of more than 100 Marines. Davis felt his legs weaken. His fingers trembled uncontrollably. The pin he had mocked now pulsed in his memory like a blazing warning sign he had ignored. "And for his actions," the general said, voice deep, "for his courage beyond any imaginable expectation, Harold Winters received the highest military honor this nation can give, the Medal of Honor." The crowd was motionless, overwhelmed. Tears pooled in the eyes of strangers, who minutes earlier hadn't even looked twice at the quiet old man. Every veteran in the room now stood at attention, back straight, jaws clenched with reverence. Davis stared at Harold, unable to comprehend how he had mocked a man whose life had shaped the history he pretended to defend. His breath grew shallow. His pulse thumped against his neck. Major General Thorne turned fully toward the corporal, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. His next words would decide a career, a future, and possibly the very identity of the young man who had started the confrontation. And just as Thorne opened his mouth to speak, something unexpected happened, something that would twist the direction of this moment in a way no one was prepared for. General Thorne's jaw tightened as he stared at Corporal Davis, and the young Marine felt the weight of that silence far more than any shouted order. The general's voice finally broke it, low and razor-sharp. "In my 3 decades of service, I have never been more ashamed of a Marine than I am of you at this moment." Davis's shoulders collapsed inward as the general continued. "You wear a uniform built on the blood of men like Sergeant Major Winters, and you used it to humiliate him." Reyes stood frozen, his stomach twisting with secondhand shame, knowing the general's words were only the beginning. Davis's eyes glistened as if he were a boy being scolded by a father he desperately wanted approval from, but the general's expression held no softness. "You are a disgrace to your rank, to your unit, and to the Eagle, Globe, and Anchor you clearly do not understand," Thorne said, each word falling like a hammer. The crowd remained utterly silent. Even the children sensed the gravity, clinging to parents with wide eyes, instinctively recognizing this wasn't just a reprimand, it was a reckoning. Thorne turned away from Davis long enough to acknowledge Reyes. "Gunnery Sergeant Reyes," he said, voice steady, "escort this corporal and his companions to my office. Their time on my base has ended." Reyes stepped forward immediately, his boots clicking sharply as he approached. Davis's breath hitched. Whatever pride he had left evaporated in the heat of the humiliation. The 2 Marines behind him stiffened, knowing they were caught in the wake of a disaster they had helped fuel. Reyes prepared to take Davis by the arm when something unexpected cut through the tension. "General." The voice was soft, old, but firm enough to freeze Reyes mid-motion. Everyone turned. Harold Winters sat still in his chair, eyes calm, posture steady, as though carrying decades of unspoken decisions heavier than this moment. "General," he repeated gently, "he is just a boy." The words hung in the air. General Thorne blinked, taken aback not by disrespect, but by compassion so deep it bordered on painful. Harold continued, "We were all young once, young and loud, young and stupid, young and proud. He does not need to be broken, he needs to be taught." The old Marine spoke with the authority of someone who had watched youth die too often to waste it carelessly. Davis stared at Harold, disbelief filling his eyes as the man he insulted fought for him. His throat tightened, and he looked down at the floor, unable to meet the old man's gaze. The crowd murmured softly, the collective shock shifting from anger to something almost reverent. People witnessing the moment realized that Harold Winters' heroism wasn't frozen in some distant battlefield. It was alive here, too, in mercy. Thorne's stern expression softened, but only slightly. He stepped closer to Harold, leaning in so that only those nearby could hear the weight of his reply. "As you wish, Sergeant Major," he said quietly, nodding with humility rarely seen in a man of his rank. "He will be taught." Harold's eyes lowered to the pin on his collar, the small object Davis had mocked. The memory washed over him again, this time softer, more solemn. He saw Captain Richards lying on a cot inside a field hospital, breath shallow, voice fading. "Don't let them forget, Winters," the dying man whispered, pressing the metal piece into his palm. "This isn't for a parade. It's for remembering." Harold blinked, returning to the present with a subtle exhale. The pin was never meant to impress. It was meant to remind, not of glory, but of cost. The crowd watched him in silence, many realizing for the first time that not all honors shine. Some are carried quietly by men who learned that survival itself can be an unbearable weight. General Thorne straightened again, turning sharply to Reyes. "Adjust the plan," he ordered. "The corporal will not be discharged, but he will learn exactly what it means to wear this uniform." Reyes nodded firmly. Davis exhaled shakily, unsure whether to feel relief or dread, knowing his fate had just shifted from destruction to a different kind of trial, one far more demanding. Harold leaned back slightly in his chair, aging frame tired but spirit unbroken. The general offered him a respectful nod before addressing the entire tent once more. "Let this be a lesson," he said. "Never assume you know the measure of a man by what he wears, but by what he survived." The civilians absorbed his words like scripture, and several veterans wiped at their eyes, reminded of silent comrades who carried similar burdens unseen. Davis stood trembling, the reality of his near disaster settling into his bones. He looked at Harold with a mixture of guilt, awe, and confusion, as though trying to understand how the man he belittled had become the one who saved him. Harold merely met his gaze with quiet acceptance, an invitation rather than condemnation. The tent remained heavy with emotion, but beneath it something else stirred change. For Davis, for the base, even for the crowd who witnessed this confrontation unfold from arrogance into revelation. And just as the atmosphere began to settle, a Marine jogged into the tent with urgency, whispering something into the general's ear, something that made Thorne's expression shift sharply once more. Whatever he heard wasn't routine, wasn't expected, and it was about to pull the story in a direction no one in that tent was prepared for. General Thorne's expression hardened instantly at the whispered message, and though civilians in the tent couldn't hear the words, everyone felt the tension spike again. The Marine messenger stepped back, leaving the general staring at Harold with a new, weightier understanding. Davis instinctively straightened his posture, sensing that whatever was happening now had nothing to do with his humiliation, and everything to do with the old man he had mocked. Thorne turned to Reyes, voice calm but taut. "Gunnery Sergeant, ensure Sergeant Major Winters does not leave this tent under any circumstances." Reyes nodded sharply, trying to maintain composure, despite not yet understanding the gravity of what command had just discovered. The two Marines behind Davis exchanged uneasy glances, suddenly aware that this situation had moved far beyond normal disciplinary action. Across the base, in the sterile lighting of the command center, Master Sergeant Frank Miller sat rigidly at his workstation, still staring at the personnel file glowing on his monitor. A few minutes earlier, he had typed Harold's name, expecting to find a standard veteran record, maybe a brief enlistment from the 50s. Instead, he'd found something that should have been impossible. A service history so decorated it read like fiction, culminating in a single designation that froze his blood Medal of Honor recipient. Captain Evans, officer of the deck, had rushed over when he heard the commotion. At first annoyed, he looked at the screen, then sucked in a sharp breath as the truth hit him. A black and white photograph stared back at them, a young Harold Winters in a dress uniform, jaw set, eyes cold with the weight of battles no one his age should have fought. Beside the photo, the Medal of Honor classification gleamed in stark, unforgiving text. Captain Evans grabbed the phone, dialing Reyes with urgency that bordered on panic. "Gunnery Sergeant Reyes, this is Captain Evans at command. What is your exact location?" he demanded, eyes still locked on the monitor. Reyes responded immediately, giving the designation for the historical exhibit tent. Evans tightened his grip on the phone. "Listen carefully. Do not let Mr. Winters leave. The base commandant is already en route to you." Back in the tent, Reyes' phone buzzed with the follow-up confirmation, and he glanced at Harold with newfound understanding. He realized he hadn't been just watching a disrespectful scene, he'd been witnessing a near disaster in the making, an insult delivered to a living legend. The pin Davis mocked suddenly carried a weight so profound it made Reyes' throat tighten. The crowd around Harold had no idea that hundreds of pages of military history had just come alive through the man sitting quietly in front of them. To them, Harold was a frail old civilian. To the United States Marine Corps, he was one of the few men whose actions could be recited in classrooms, memorials, and moments of silence. General Thorne cleared his throat, regaining the attention of everyone in the tent. "Sergeant Major Winters," he said with reverence heavy in every syllable, "I have just been informed of something significant regarding your presence here today." The old man looked up slowly, eyes steady, neither intimidated nor surprised. He had lived long enough to know that history has a way of finding those who carry it. Davis watched, dread building in his chest. He understood now that he had insulted someone far beyond his comprehension, someone whose quiet stillness wasn't weakness, but the calm forged in places where men died, screaming. His mouth felt dry, and he swallowed hard, unable to look away. Thorne continued, addressing the entire tent. The historical exhibit contains artifacts from the 1st Marine Division. What many do not realize is that one of the individuals responsible for several of those artifacts being preserved is sitting right here among you. The crowd shifted, leaning in, the realization spreading like electricity. Harold's gaze drifted once more to the pin on his collar, the small, tarnished piece that had carried him through a lifetime. The memory returned, clearer now. The field hospital, the dying breath of Captain Richards, the whispered promise to remember, the weight of the entrenching tool still warm from battle. He felt the cold again, not on his skin, but in his bones. In the command center, Miller and Evans stood silently, staring at Harold's record, his tours, his wounds, his commendations. Among them were battles etched into American history. Peleliu, Okinawa, Chosin, Keisan. Many Marines today only learned about these places from textbooks or grainy documentaries. Harold had walked through them with blood on his boots. Back in the tent, civilians began to understand that the elderly man in the chair had endured more than their entire families combined. A woman with tears in her eyes whispered to her husband, "How could that corporal speak to him that way?" The husband shook his head, jaw tight, unable to answer. General Thorne took one step closer to Harold. "Sir," he said, voice thickening, "it is an honor to have you here today, but command has just made something very clear. You are not just a distinguished veteran. You are one of the Marine Corps' most sacred living connections to the battles that defined us." Harold said nothing. His silence was not pride, but humility, the kind of humility born from knowing exactly what heroism had cost him. His eyes softened at the general's words, but he did not smile. He never had. Not when medals were pinned to his chest, not when parades passed him by, not when strangers thanked him. He always remembered the men who didn't come home. Reyes stepped closer, lowering his voice near Davis. "You really did not know who you were talking to," he murmured. Davis closed his eyes, fighting the sting of humiliation, wishing he could step back in time and undo every word he had spoken. A cold sweat broke across his skin. Thorne exhaled slowly, preparing to address the crowd again. But before he could speak, another Marine rushed into the tent breathless, eyes wide, carrying a folder in his shaking hands. He pushed through the front of the crowd to reach the general. "Sir, you need to see this immediately," the young Marine said, voice trembling not from fear but from awe. Thorne opened the folder, scanned the first page, and his face changed, tightening, then freezing, because inside that folder was a revelation no one expected. A revelation that would completely reshape everything they thought they knew about Harold Winters. And when General Thorne lifted his eyes, the entire tent could feel the shift. Something enormous was coming next. General Thorne took the folder from the young Marine, opened it, and the change in his face was immediate, subtle but unmistakable. His eyes narrowed, and his jaw tightened as he read the first few lines. The kind of classified detail that even a two-star general did not see casually. The crowd leaned forward as one, sensing another shift in the air. Reyes stepped closer, voice low. "Sir, what is it?" Thorne did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned the page slowly, absorbing the information with a seriousness that quieted even the restless children in the back. Davis watched with dread twisting in his stomach. Every second the general read seemed to stack more weight onto his guilt. Thorne finally exhaled sharply and closed the folder halfway, not yet revealing its contents. "Sergeant Major Winters," he said, voice reverent but edged with caution, "Command supplied additional documentation about your record. It appears there are elements of your service that were never fully disclosed to the public." Harold blinked once, slowly, as though he had expected this moment to arrive someday. The general continued, speaking not just to Harold, but to everyone in the tent. "Alongside your Medal of Honor citation, there are 3 classified operations connected to your name, operations that remained sealed for decades." A ripple of shock moved through the crowd. Even the civilians recognized the weight of classified operations spoken by a general. Davis felt his knees weaken again. He had not just insulted a Medal of Honor recipient, he had insulted a man who had served in operations so secret that even most officers never heard of them. Harold lowered his gaze, not to avoid the truth, but because he had lived long enough to know that some memories were never meant for public consumption. General Thorne opened the folder again, flipping to a specific page. His voice softened, not with pity, but with awe. It says here that during one of these operations, you led a team of 5 Marines through 9 miles of enemy territory to extract wounded soldiers from a downed aircraft. He paused. And that the mission was deemed impossible by every intelligence officer who reviewed the terrain. A murmur spread across the tent, people whispering in disbelief. The man who had sat quietly in a folding chair minutes ago had apparently accomplished feats most Marines only read about in the most elite training manuals. Harold's fingers brushed the pin on his collar again, as if grounding himself. Thorne kept reading. It also states that you refused a second Medal of Honor nomination. He lifted his eyes slowly, scanning the crowd before looking at Harold. You turned it down. A heavy silence followed, broken only when an older veteran whispered, He refused it, my God. Reyes swallowed hard, emotions tightening in his chest. He understood what it meant to reject an honor like that. It meant the man valued the lives of others, above recognition, above glory, above himself. It meant, simply, that Harold Winters was built from something rare. Davis's breathing hitched again, his memories of his own arrogance mocking Harold's silence, laughing at the pin, treating him like a confused old civilian, burned through him like fire. He felt exposed, ashamed, and painfully aware of how small he was in the presence of real greatness. General Thorne closed the folder and addressed the crowd. Sergeant Major Winters' record was sealed after Vietnam due to the nature of his assignments. Even I did not know the full extent of his service until this very moment. Harold did not react outwardly, but there was a faint heaviness in the air around him, a sense of stories buried beneath decades of silence. Thorne stepped closer to Harold, speaking quietly. Sir, if I may ask, why did you never come forward? Why not allow the Corps to honor you properly? Harold looked up, his pale blue eyes, tired but resolute. Because, he said softly, the men who deserved those honors didn't come home. The tent fell silent again, and this time the silence felt sacred. Civilians wiped their eyes. Veterans stood even straighter. Even children sensed they were witnessing something their parents would remember for the rest of their lives. Harold's voice had carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken names he had never forgotten. General Thorne placed a hand briefly over his heart. Then we honor them through you, Sergeant Major. Harold nodded with the gentleness of acceptance rather than pride, a humility so profound it hurt to witness. His eyes drifted down once more toward the small, battered pin on his collar, the only piece of the past he allowed himself to carry publicly. Reyes slowly approached Davis, lowering his voice so only he could hear. You understand now? Davis nodded, tears welling, unable to form words. Reyes continued, This is the kind of Marine you're supposed to become, not because of medals, because of the burden he carries with that little pin. Davis swallowed, shame burning deeper than any punishment he had ever faced. General Thorne then addressed the crowd again. Today, each of you has witnessed something the Corps itself took years to understand. The greatest heroes are often the quietest ones. His words resonated through the tent like an echo carried by history itself. But before he could continue, the young Marine who had delivered the folder raised his hand shakily. Sir, there is one more page. Thorne frowned. Another page? The young Marine nodded, eyes wide. Yes, sir. And this one is marked as restricted access. The general took the folder again, opened the final page, and froze. Whatever he saw made his face go pale, the kind of reaction no one expected from a man of his rank. The tent fell into deeper silence as he read the final classified line aloud, voice tight and disbelieving. Harold Winters is listed as missing in action since 1973. The entire tent stopped breathing. Missing in action, 1973. Yet Harold was sitting right in front of them, and before anyone could speak, Harold closed his eyes, as if a truth he had spent half a century burying had finally come to claim him. The words, missing in action since 1973, hung in the air like a bomb detonating in silence. Civilians stared at Harold as though reality had split open. Veterans stiffened with instinctual confusion, their minds trying to reconcile military impossibility with the man sitting calmly before them. Reyes's breath caught in his throat as he whispered, How is that even possible? But no one dared answer. General Thorne looked from the paper to Harold, then back again, as if expecting the ink to rearrange itself into something rational. The entire tent seemed to tilt, the weight of the revelation altering everything they thought they understood about the quiet old man. Davis stared wide-eyed, desperately trying to understand how a man he had mocked minutes earlier now stood outside even the boundaries of official military history. Thorne stepped closer, his voice barely steady. "Sergeant Major, the records say you never returned from your final mission in Vietnam. You were presumed dead." Harold opened his eyes slowly, but the calmness in them was no longer peaceful. It was the calm of a man who had outrun ghosts for 50 years and knew they had finally caught him. He didn't deny it. He didn't flinch. He simply looked at the general, accepting that buried truth had surfaced. A woman in the crowd gasped. Someone muttered, "Missing in action for half a century?" While another civilian whispered, "How is he even here?" The atmosphere thickened with a strange mix of awe, fear, and reverence. The idea that a man marked dead by the Marine Corps had walked into a public base event was almost supernatural. Thorne cleared his throat. "Sergeant Major Winters, can you explain this?" Harold's fingers brushed the old pin again, the metal warm from his skin. "No explanation that matters to the bureaucracy," he said quietly. "Only the truth that mattered to the men I was with." His voice carried exhaustion, but also a conviction carved by decades of silence. Reyes took a small step forward. "Sir, were you captured?" he asked, voice gentle but edged with a soldier's dread. Harold shook his head once. "No, I was the last one left." Those few words carried a weight so heavy that several veterans in the crowd looked away, unable to meet the gaze of someone who had survived something they could only imagine. General Thorne's jaw clenched. "The file says your evacuation team never found you. They found signs of a firefight. Blood in the dirt, a name carved into a tree. They assumed—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Harold nodded slowly. "They assumed right," he said. "Someone died there. But it wasn't me." A cold silence settled over the tent. What Harold had lived through in 1973 was far more than any official report could describe. Davis felt his chest tighten, not with fear of punishment anymore, but with something he had never felt before. The crushing awareness that he had mocked a man whose life had been measured not in years, but in survival against impossible odds. Thorne rubbed his forehead, overwhelmed by the implications. "Sergeant Major, if you survived, why didn't you return? Why not report in? Why not come home?" Harold looked down at his hands, at the wrinkles that carried everything time refused to erase. "Because the men I led didn't come home," he murmured. "It didn't feel right to return when I couldn't bring them with me." The crowd reacted with a ripple of emotion, the pain in Harold's voice slicing through every heart present. A Vietnam veteran pressed a shaking hand to his lips, whispering, "I knew men like him. Men who never stopped living over there." The air felt thick with grief, the kind that lingers for lifetimes. Harold continued, "For years I stayed near the villages, helped where I could, tended to the wounded, buried who needed burying." He paused, eyes distant. "War does not end because a uniform leaves. Sometimes it ends when the last memory finally fades." His words held a raw truth that made several civilians wipe their eyes quietly. General Thorne's voice softened. "Then how did you finally return?" Harold inhaled deeply, the motion slow and weary. "A missionary group found me. I was old enough then that no one questioned the years on my face. They brought me back. I didn't tell them who I was." He looked at the floor. It seemed simpler. Davis felt his throat tighten as he realized Harold had walked through the world for decades carrying an identity no one knew, a history no one saw, a burden no one shared. The humiliation he had inflicted earlier now felt microscopic compared to the scale of Harold's silent suffering. Thorne closed the folder gently, as if afraid any harsh movement might disturb the fragile truth inside it. "Sergeant Major Winters, the Marine Corps owes you more than I can express, more than any medal or ceremony could ever repay." Harold looked up, meeting his eyes. "The Corps owes me nothing," he said quietly. "The Corps gave me a family, even if most of them never came back." Reyes looked down, fighting the tightness in his chest. The old man's quiet dignity was suffocating in the most powerful way. He'd seen brave men, strong men, broken men, but never someone who embodied all three at once. The general turned sharply to Davis. But this time there was no rage in his expression, only a solemn awareness of how easily arrogance could collide with greatness. "Corporal," Thorne said slowly, "you owe this man more than an apology. You owe him your transformation." Davis swallowed, nodding, his voice cracking as he whispered, "Yes, sir." But before the moment could settle, a sudden movement at the tent entrance broke the silence. A military police officer jogged inside, saluting quickly. "General Thorne, sir. There is someone outside insisting on speaking with Sergeant Major Winters. They said they knew him in Vietnam." The general frowned. "Who?" The officer hesitated. "A man who says his name is Lieutenant Alan Brewer. He claims Sergeant Major Winters saved his life in 1973. Harold's eyes widened, not in fear, but in shock, so deep it broke the calm he had carried for decades. Because Lieutenant Alan Brewer was supposed to be dead, Harold had buried him with his own hands. The tent went silent as every head turned toward the military police officer who had delivered the impossible news. Lieutenant Alan Brewer, a name that belonged to a man, Harold Winters, believed he had buried 52 years ago in a shallow grave outside a burning Vietnamese village. Harold's lips parted slightly, breath-catching, the facade of calm finally cracking as he whispered, "That cannot be." General Thorne studied Harold's expression, sensing that this wasn't mild surprise but the shock of a man confronting a ghost. Reyes stepped forward, eyes shifting between the military police officer and Harold. "Sir, did you know Lieutenant Brewer personally?" Harold's gaze drifted downward, his voice barely steady. "I carried him for 2 miles under fire, and when his pulse stopped, I laid him to rest myself." The civilians in the tent stared in horrified awe. It wasn't just that Brewer was alive, it was that Harold had lived half a century believing he had failed to save the man. Davis, already shaken by his earlier actions, now felt something new. The crushing weight of understanding that Harold Winters had spent a lifetime haunted by a death that may never have happened. General Thorne nodded to the military police officer. "Bring him in." The officer saluted and disappeared outside. A tense hush filled the tent, thicker than anything before. For several long seconds, no one moved, no one spoke. Even the youngest children sensed they were witnessing something sacred. The flap opened, and an older man stepped into the tent, supported by a cane. His hair was silver, his face lined with decades of hardship, but his eyes sharp. Alert swept across the room with the urgency of someone searching for a single familiar soul. When his gaze landed on Harold, his breath hitched. "Harold? Winters?" he said, voice trembling. Is that really you?" Harold rose from his chair slowly, knees stiff but resolve steady. He stared at the man before him, as though reality were trying to rewrite itself in front of his eyes. "Alan, you died," Harold murmured. "I felt your pulse fade. I saw the blood. His voice cracked and he couldn't finish the sentence. Brewer stepped closer. "I was unconscious when you left me. The villagers found me. A medic there kept me alive. I tried to find you, Winters, but command listed you as missing in action. They assumed we both died." Reyes felt a lump form in his throat. The military had built entire narratives around men who never knew the truth of each other's survival. And here they were, 2 forgotten veterans, meeting again after decades of silence. Brewer continued, "I spent years searching for any trace of you. They told me you'd never come home. I thought you died out there alone." Harold shook his head painfully. "No, I thought you were gone. Everything I did afterward, every year I stayed behind, I did because I believed I hadn't brought you home." The weight of 50 years settled between the two men like a shadow given form. Davis watched through blurry eyes as Harold reached forward, resting a trembling hand on Brewer's shoulder. It wasn't a gesture of reunion, it was a gesture of relief, so profound it softened the entire room. Civilians began wiping tears, and even the stoic Marines swallowed hard. General Thorne stepped forward. "Lieutenant Brewer, why come today? What led you here?" Brewer straightened slightly, his voice steadying. "For years, I wondered why Sergeant Major Winters never resurfaced. I only recently learned that a man matching his description had been spotted at a veterans hall in Northwood. When I heard the base was holding an open house, I came hoping, praying it was true." Reyes exhaled deeply. "So you had no idea he was here today?" Brewer shook his head. "None. I just knew that if Harold Winters was still alive, destiny would put us in the same place eventually." Harold's eyes grew distant, overwhelmed by memories that suddenly had new meaning. The decades he spent living in the shadows weren't just fueled by guilt, they were fueled by a ghost that was never dead. Davis took a step forward, unable to stay silent. "Sir, I am so sorry for everything I said. I was ignorant. I was wrong." Harold looked at him, really looked at him, and something gentle passed through his eyes. "Ignorance can be cured," he said softly, "but only if you choose to understand." Thorne placed a hand on Davis's shoulder. "And he will," the general said firmly. "Starting today." The corporal nodded, tears streaking down his face, the enormity of the moment overwhelming him. He had mocked a man whose entire life was built from sacrifice, loss, and burdens that no young Marine could begin to comprehend. Brewer looked down at Harold's collar. "You still have it," he said, voice trembling. "The pin from Captain Richards." Harold touched the tarnished piece gently. "He told me to never let them forget." Brewer's eyes softened. "You honored that promise more than any of us could have." The tent was utterly silent as the two men stood together, two survivors of a world no one else in the room could fathom. It was the kind of moment that history books never capture but lives inside the people who witnessed it. General Thorne cleared his throat, speaking with renewed gravity. "Sergeant Major Winters, Lieutenant Brewer, Command Headquarters will need to be notified immediately. This discovery changes multiple classified records." Brewer nodded. Harold simply closed his eyes, accepting that the past he had avoided was now walking beside him again. But before Thorne could issue another order, a second Marine burst into the tent with a pale face and a clipboard clutched tightly to his chest. "Sir, there is an urgent issue outside related to Sergeant Major Winters' file." "Something more." The general frowned. "More?" The Marine nodded, throat tight. "Yes, sir. Command says there is a person who needs to speak with Sergeant Major Winters immediately. They claim to be family." Harold's eyes snapped open, not in fear, but in a shock deeper than anything so far. Because Harold Winters had no surviving family. Not since 1950. The tent fell into stunned silence as the Marine's words echoed. Someone outside claimed to be Harold Winters' family. That was impossible. Harold's entire family had died during the 1950s, a tragedy recorded even in his sealed military file. Harold stood frozen, his hands trembling slightly. Not from fear, but from a shock so deep it felt like the ground beneath him had shifted. General Thorne narrowed his eyes, uncertain whether this was a misunderstanding or something far more complicated. "Family?" he repeated, voice thick with skepticism. Reyes looked between Harold and Brewer, both men wearing expressions shaped by decades of war, loss, and the ghosts they carried. "Sir, Sergeant Major Winters has no surviving relatives. That is in his record," Reyes stated quietly, but the Marine with the clipboard shook his head. "Sir," the young Marine said, swallowing hard. "Command confirmed the identity. The individual waiting outside has DNA verification on file. They were matched to Sergeant Major Winters 20 years ago." The crowd gasped, the civilians whispering in confusion, while the veterans stiffened, as if sensing something monumental was unfolding. Harold's breath grew shallow. He whispered almost to himself, "No, that cannot be. My family. They were gone long before I even left for Korea." Brewer touched Harold's arm gently, steadying him. "Harold, who could it be?" The old Marine shook his head slowly. "There is no one left. Not a soul." General Thorne motioned for the Marine to bring the person in. The young Marine nodded and jogged outside, leaving the tent in an electric hush. Harold's knees weakened, and Reyes moved closer, just in case. The crowd parted instinctively, forming a path from the entrance to Harold's folding chair, a path that felt more like a bridge between the past and something unimaginable. The tent flap opened again, but this time no decorated officer, no battle-weary veteran, no ghost from a forgotten war stepped inside. Instead, a woman in her late 40s entered, her eyes red from tears that hadn't yet fallen. She held a small envelope in her hands, trembling as she scanned the room until her gaze locked onto Harold. The moment their eyes met, she let out a soft, broken gasp. "Grandfather," she whispered. The word hit Harold like a blow. He staggered slightly, gripping the edge of his chair. "No," he whispered hoarsely. "My son, my wife, they died in 1951. There was no child." The woman stepped forward slowly, her voice shaking. "Your wife lived long enough to give birth," she said. "The doctors saved your son. He grew up believing you had died in the war because that was what the Marine Corps told them." Harold's breath shattered into uneven pieces. The pain of old grief stirred violently in his chest. "My boy, survived?" he whispered. "All these years, he survived?" She nodded, tears spilling now. "He survived. He became a teacher. He married my mother. He raised me on stories of a father he never met." She held up the envelope. "This is his final letter. He passed away 3 years ago, still hoping to find you." The weight of her words crushed Harold's heart and lifted it at the same time, a paradox of grief and miracle colliding. Harold reached for the letter with trembling hands. The envelope was worn, the ink faded, suggesting it had been touched thousands of times. The woman swallowed hard. He sent this to the Department of Veterans Affairs every year, updated with new contact information, hoping it would reach you someday. It never did. Harold closed his eyes, the pain almost too much to bear. All these years, he whispered, I thought I had no one left. Brewer placed a steady hand on Harold's shoulder. You were wrong, my friend, he said softly. You had a son. You have a granddaughter. You have family. The civilians wiped tears openly now, the veterans standing in silent reverence for a man whose life had been shaped by war in every way. A life can be through loss, through sacrifice, and now, unexpectedly, through resurrection. General Thorne looked at the granddaughter gently. How did you find this place today? She took a deep breath. A former Marine from my father's unit contacted me. He said someone had seen a man at the Veterans Hall who looked exactly like the photo my father kept of Harold Winters. She looked at Harold again. I came because I had to know. Harold sank into his chair, clutching the envelope to his chest. His voice, fragile but full of a new trembling hope, whispered, I had a son. I had a son. The granddaughter knelt beside him. You still have me, she said softly. I am here. I found you. The reunion washed over the tent like a wave, warm and devastating all at once. Davis covered his face, overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of what he'd nearly destroyed. Reyes felt something deep crack open in his chest, admiration, sorrow, gratitude. But before Harold could open the letter, another Marine sprinted into the tent, pale and breathless, holding a radio that crackled with urgency. General Thorne Command is ordering immediate lockdown of the base, he shouted. They said it's connected to Sergeant Major Winters. General Thorne stiffened. Harold looked up sharply. The granddaughter froze, and the Marine delivered the final blow. Sir, they say someone else is coming for him. The words, someone else is coming for him, struck the tent like a physical blow. Every civilian instinctively drew back. Veterans straightened as if preparing for contact, and General Thorne's eyes sharpened with the reflex of a man trained to anticipate threats before they arrived. Harold, still holding the unopened envelope from his son, felt a chill crawl slowly down his spine. Reyes stepped forward immediately. Marine, clarify that order, he demanded. The young Marine swallowed hard, gripping his radio. Sir, Command says an unidentified individual entered the base about 15 minutes ago using outdated clearance credentials. They bypassed 2 outer checkpoints before security realized the access code belonged to a classified file connected to Sergeant Major Winters' last mission. A murmur swept through the tent as civilians exchanged uneasy glances. Brewer stiffened. He recognized the tension in Harold's posture instantly. Harold, he said quietly, who would have classified clearance from 1973? Harold didn't answer. His eyes had gone distant again, cold, hard, and haunted like a soldier slipping back into battlefield mode after decades of trying to live as a civilian. General Thorne snapped his fingers at his escort. Secure the perimeter around this tent. No one in or out without my authorization. Military police officers moved instantly, spreading out and sealing the entrances as the situation escalated from emotional to tactical. The air thickened with the kind of pressure that precedes dangerous revelations. Harold exhaled slowly. There is only one man, he said quietly, who could be tied to my final mission and still be alive. Reyes leaned closer. Who, sir? Harold's hand brushed the tarnished pin on his collar, grounding himself. Not an enemy, he murmured, but someone who should have died with the rest of my unit. The granddaughter watched him with rising fear. Grandfather, who are you talking about? Harold hesitated, the weight of memory bending his shoulders. On our last mission, there was someone else sent with us. A man who did not belong there. Someone assigned to retrieve intelligence hidden in the village we were sent to evacuate. Brewer turned sharply, eyes wide. Harold, you do not mean... Before he could finish, the base lighting flickered for a brief second, then stabilized. General Thorne looked up immediately. What was that? The Marine with the radio answered, voice tight. Sir, internal security reports a temporary disruption in the surveillance grid. Cameras in sectors 3 and 4 went offline for 8 seconds. That is where the unidentified individual was last seen. Thorne's expression hardened. Someone is exploiting old operations data. That is impossible unless they were part of those operations, Brewer whispered. Then it is him, after all these years. Harold's jaw tightened, confirming what Brewer feared. He survived, Harold said. Just like we did. Davis felt a cold wave of fear drip down his spine. This wasn't just military history anymore. It was a living threat tied to a mission so buried that even official records barely mentioned it. Reyes stepped closer to Harold. Sir, who was he? Harold looked up, eyes shining with a mixture of grief and dread. Captain Nathan Kincaid, he said softly. Intelligence officer, my superior on the operation. Brewer ran a hand over his face. Harold, Kincaid was declared missing in action before you were. They said he was presumed killed in an ambush. Harold nodded bitterly. It was no ambush. He left us, took the documents we were supposed to recover, and ran when the fighting got bad. I stayed behind with the wounded. That is why only one of us came out alive. General Thorne's jaw tightened. Are you saying Captain Kincaid defected? Harold met his gaze with a grim calm. I am saying he disappeared with intelligence the Corps never recovered, and if he is here now, he looked at the granddaughter, then at Brewer, then at Thorne. He is not here to reunite. The civilians around them shivered, sensing the danger. The granddaughter gripped Harold's arm tightly. Grandfather, what does he want? Harold swallowed. If Kincaid is alive, he has had 50 years to shape himself into someone dangerous. He would not come here unless he wanted something critical. Reyes looked at the envelope Harold still held. Sir, is it connected to your family? Harold shook his head slowly. No, this is personal. Mission personal. The base lights flickered again longer this time, and the radio crackled with static. The Marine pressed the transmission button. Command, report status. But the radio cut out mid-sentence. General Thorne's voice dropped to a steady, dangerous calm. Everyone stay alert. Something is happening across the base. Brewer stepped beside Harold as if returning to formation after decades. We face this together, he said. Harold gave a faint nod, like we always did. The granddaughter clutched Harold's hand, refusing to let go. Whatever this is, she whispered, you are not facing it alone. Davis gathered what little courage he had, and moved closer too. Sir, he said softly, if this man is a danger, I want to help. Before Harold could respond, a shadow appeared at the tent entrance, calm, tall, and unmoving. The silhouette did not match any Marine stationed at the door. Every military police officer snapped their weapons up instantly. The figure stepped forward into the light, and Harold Winters whispered one word filled with fear, disbelief, and something darker. Kincaid. Captain Nathan Kincaid stepped fully into the tent, the light revealing a face carved by age but not softened by it. His hair was gray, his posture straight, and though he wore civilian clothes, his eyes carried the cold calculation of a man who had never stopped living inside covert operations. The entire tent seemed to pull back from him instinctively, as if recognizing danger even without understanding why. General Thorne stiffened, instantly analyzing every detail, gait, demeanor, threat level, while Harold's granddaughter clutched his arm tighter. Brewer took one shaky step forward, his voice a hoarse whisper. Kincaid. After all these years. Kincaid's gaze slid across the crowd, ignoring the armed military police officers, ignoring General Thorne, ignoring even the granddaughter, until his eyes landed squarely on Harold. Winters, he said, voice low and unsettlingly calm, you are a hard man to find. Harold's grip tightened around the envelope in his hand as if grounding himself against memories he had buried deep enough to hope they would never surface again. You were supposed to be dead, Harold replied, voice steady despite the storm inside him. We saw your blood in the dirt. We saw the trail end. A thin smile crept across Kincaid's lips. Reports can be shaped. He took 2 steps closer, ignoring the military police officers whose weapons followed his every move. I survived because I had to. Because there was work left undone. Reyes felt his jaw clench. That tone wasn't one of reunion, but of obsession. General Thorne raised a hand, halting his military police officers from firing or detaining. Identify yourself and your purpose on this base, Thorne commanded, voice sharp as steel. Kincaid barely glanced at him. General, my clearance once outranked yours. You may not find that in your current database, of course. Some files are deeper than you think. The temperature in the tent seemed to drop. Even civilians sensed that this man was not bluffing. Davis stood frozen, the magnitude of the situation dwarfing anything he had ever imagined when he first stepped into uniform. The young Marine understood now that he wasn't witnessing history. He was standing inside it. Harold took a step forward, anger bleeding into his voice for the first time. You left us. You abandoned your men. You left wounded Marines to die so you could take the documents for yourself. Kincaid's eyes narrowed. I completed the mission objective. You chose sentiment over strategic necessity. The coldness in his tone made several veterans recoil. It was the kind of rationalization only a man who had crossed every moral line could believe. Brewer's voice cracked with fury. You deserted us. You let good men die. Kincaid finally faced him. Sacrifice is an unavoidable currency in intelligence work. Some men are simply less valuable than others. The tent erupted in a collective gasp. Even the military police officers took involuntary steps closer, hands gripping weapons tighter. Harold's granddaughter trembled, horrified not just by Kincaid's words, but by the fact that he spoke them without remorse. Harold stepped in front of her protectively, the old warrior instinct returning instantly to his posture. "What do you want?" he demanded. Kincaid's smile faded. "Closure," he said. "There are things you know, Winters, things only you and I were briefed on. The documents I took decades ago remain incomplete without your part of the information." General Thorne's eyes flashed with fury. "This is Marine Corps soil. You will disclose nothing classified here." Kincaid ignored him again. "Winters, you and I both know the truth wasn't meant for people like him." Reyes stepped between them, voice steady but laced with warning. "Captain Kincaid, you will keep your distance from Sergeant Major Winters." Kincaid tilted his head. "Or what, Gunnery Sergeant? You will shoot me in front of civilians?" The military police officers bristled, but held their positions. Harold lifted his chin. "I will not tell you anything." Kincaid's eyes hardened. "You already did, when you stayed alive." The cryptic statement made the crowd shift uneasily. Even Brewer looked confused. Then Kincaid slowly reached into his jacket. Military police officers jerked their weapons up instantly, but Kincaid merely held up a thin, sealed envelope. He extended it toward Harold. "This belongs to you," he said. "It was given to me on the day of the mission. I was instructed to deliver it only if I ever found you alive." Harold stared at the envelope as if it were radioactive. His hands shook as he reached out, but he hesitated inches from taking it. Reyes looked to Thorne for approval, and the general gave a single firm nod. Harold accepted the envelope, the paper old and brittle, the seal intact after half a century. "What is in it?" Brewer asked, voice tight. Kincaid smirked. "Answers." Harold tore the seal slowly, revealing a single sheet of aged paper folded carefully. The entire tent leaned forward. Breaths held, waiting. Harold unfolded it. "Read the first line," and his entire expression shattered. Harold staggered backward, gripping his chest as if an unseen force had hit him. The granddaughter cried out, reaching for him, but Harold could only stare at the paper with eyes full of shock, pain, disbelief, and something darker. General Thorne rushed forward. "Sergeant Major, what is it?" Harold's lips moved, the words barely escaping. This cannot be real." His fingers trembled violently as he stared at the letter, unable to look away. Kincaid's smile widened just slightly. "Now you understand why I came. Because written on that page, in handwriting Harold recognized from a lifetime ago, was a single sentence that changed everything. They lied to you about who died that day. And before anyone could speak, the tent's alarms erupted in a deafening wail. The alarms blared through the tent, sharp and metallic, drowning out the stunned murmurs as Harold stood frozen with the letter trembling in his hand. Red emergency lights pulsed across the canvas walls, casting the entire scene in a warlike glow that made every Marine instinctively shift into defensive posture. General Thorne barked orders immediately, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Military police, secure the entrances. Reyes, get civilians to the back. No one moves unless I say so." Civilians scrambled to comply, guided by Marines with outstretched arms, while veterans instinctively stepped forward to form a protective line in front of the elderly. Yet amid the movement, Harold couldn't move at all. He stared at the letter like it was a ghost, materializing in ink. Brewer gripped his arm. "Harold, what does it say? What do they mean about lies?" But Harold didn't answer. His eyes remained locked on the sentence that had detonated inside him like a buried mine. Kincaid watched him with unsettling calm, hands clasped behind his back as though the alarms, weapons, and hostile stares were nothing more than background noise. "You understand now, Winters," he said softly. "Nothing about that mission was as it seemed." General Thorne rounded on him. "Captain Kincaid, if you know anything about this breach or these alarms, you will speak now." But Kincaid didn't even glance at the general. His focus remained solely on Harold, as if the rest of the world were irrelevant. Harold finally tore his eyes from the page, his voice raw and fractured. They said the bodies we recovered, the ones we buried." His chest hitched. "One of them was not who we thought." Brewer frowned deeply. "Harold, what are you talking about?" Harold turned the letter toward him with trembling hands. Brewer read the line and went pale, the color draining from his face as though he had seen a ghost rise from the earth. Reyes leaned closer, voice tense. "What does it say, Lieutenant?" Brewer swallowed hard. "It says, One of the men we buried, one of the bodies Harold carried through fire and gunfire, was switched. The tent erupted in confused murmurs. Davis blinked rapidly. Switched? By who? Brewer looked at Harold with horror dawning in his eyes. By someone who did not want us to know who actually died that day. General Thorne stiffened. Why? What was the purpose? Kincaid answered before anyone else could. Because the body that should have been found was not meant to be identified. Not then. Not ever. The granddaughter clutched Harold's arm tighter, shaking. Grandfather, whose body was really there? Harold's voice cracked. Not Captain Richards. Not the man who gave me this pin. Someone else. Thorne pressed forward. Winters, think. Who else could it have been? Harold closed his eyes, memories clawing through decades of buried trauma. The face was burned. The dog tags melted. I carried him because I thought... His voice trembled violently. I thought I knew who I was burying. Reyes' voice sharpened. Then who was it? Harold looked straight at Kincaid, and the realization hit him like a hammer. It was you, he whispered. It was supposed to be you in that grave. The tent fell silent again, the alarms now blaring in the background like echoes of Harold's last mission. Kincaid's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in his eyes. Correct, he said simply. Brewer stepped closer to him, fists clenched. You let us believe you died. You let the Corps believe you died. Why? Kincaid shrugged lightly. Because I needed the world to think that man was gone. The work I needed to do required shadows, not dog tags. His words chilled everyone around him. This wasn't the confession of a man, it was the justification of a ghost masquerading as one. General Thorne snapped. What work? What mission? Kincaid shifted his gaze to him finally. The same mission that never ended. The one Harold unknowingly carried for 50 years. Harold recoiled. I carried nothing for you, he growled, a spark of old fury igniting behind his eyes. Kincaid shook his head slowly. You carried the only piece that mattered, the one thing I never retrieved. The granddaughter stepped in front of Harold protectively. You are not taking anything from him. Kincaid's expression changed just slightly, recognition flickering across his face. So this is the granddaughter, the one with matching DNA. The room stiffened. Thorne barked. You stay away from her. But Kincaid ignored him again. Harold's voice rose, rough with alarm. What does my family have to do with this? Kincaid's answer was a quiet dagger. Because the one person who survived that mission, the one person whose identity was wiped, is connected to your bloodline. The granddaughter's face drained of color. Are you saying... Before she could finish, one of the military police officers at the tent entrance shouted, General, movement outside! Someone else is approaching fast! The alarms intensified, the red lights flashing violently now. General Thorne spun toward the exit, hand near his sidearm. Who is it? He demanded. The military police officer swallowed hard. Sir, they're using Sergeant Major Winter's old call sign. Harold froze. His call sign had not been spoken aloud since 1973, and the voice calling it out now was a voice he knew, a voice he had not heard since the day he was declared missing in action. The tent fell into absolute silence as the military police officer's voice echoed. Someone outside was calling Harold Winters' old call sign, a call sign buried in classified archives and spoken only by men who had long turned to dust. Harold's breath trembled, his fingers tightening around the letter as he whispered, That is impossible. That cannot be him. The granddaughter stepped closer, terrified yet unwilling to move away from him. General Thorne raised his hand. Open the tent flap, slowly, weapons ready. The military police officers obeyed, moving with synchronized precision as they parted the entrance. Outside, illuminated by the flashing red alarms, stood a man leaning heavily on a crutch, his uniform civilian but his posture unmistakably military. His face was aged, scarred, and barely recognizable, yet when his eyes locked onto Harold's, something electric surged through the tent. Winters, the man said, voice cracked but steady. You held the line, and I never got to thank you. Harold staggered forward, his knees almost giving out. Richards? He choked. Captain, Richards, you were dead. I buried you. I buried you myself. The man shook his head, tears gathering in scarred eyes. You buried a body, but it was not mine. I crawled into the ravine after the blast. They found me days later. I was evacuated under a classified assignment and never allowed to make contact. They told me you were missing in action. Brewer grabbed the back of a chair to steady himself as shock rippled through him. Harold carried your pin for 50 years, he whispered. He blamed himself every day. Captain Richards stepped closer, eyes full of grief. I know. I read the report later. They told me you were gone. I tried to come back for you. They refused clearance. They used my survival for intelligence operations. Harold's face tightened, the realization settling into him like a final, cruel twist of fate. So all these years, we thought the other had died. Richards nodded, emotion thickening his voice. Kincaid told command I was dead so he could disappear with the documents, and they let him. The tent erupted in murmurs of disbelief, civilians and Marines alike processing the impossible convergence of two ghosts returning to life in a single day. Harold stepped slowly toward Richards until they stood inches apart, two men who had survived hell and lived decades, thinking the other had not. Harold placed a trembling hand on Richards' shoulder. "We lost everyone that day," he whispered. Richards nodded painfully. "Yes, but you did not fail them, Winters. You carried us farther than any man could." Harold closed his eyes, tears slipping down his face for the first time in decades. "I carried that weight alone." Richards shook his head. "Not anymore." General Thorne inhaled deeply. The magnitude of what he was witnessing nearly overwhelming even for a man who had seen war's brutal truth. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "the Marine Corps owes both of you a debt beyond words." He turned to Kincaid, his expression returning to steel. "But you will answer for the deception, the abandonment, and the danger you have brought to this base." Kincaid shrugged slightly, as though the world closing in on him meant nothing. The truth was never meant to stay buried, and now that it is out, they will come looking for all of us. Reyes stepped forward, jaw clenched. "Who will?" Kincaid smiled faintly, but it was not the smile of a man amused, rather the one of a man who has lived too long without fear. The ones who financed the mission, the ones who want what Winters knows. General Thorne motioned for military police officers to detain him. "You are done hiding behind shadows." But before they could take him, Harold raised a hand slightly. "Let him speak," he said softly. Everyone paused. Harold's voice carried the authority of a man who had seen the cost of silence. "Let him speak, because only he knows what this was all truly about." Kincaid glanced at Harold, eyes narrowing with an odd mixture of respect and calculation. "Very well," he said. "The truth is simple. Winters holds the final memory of a location, a cache, something hidden during that mission, something governments still want." Harold shook his head slowly. "I do not remember anything like that." Kincaid's smirk widened. "You do. You just buried it deep to survive. But they will come for it now." The granddaughter stepped in front of Harold defiantly. "He is not going anywhere with you." Kincaid's gaze softened strangely. "I never intended to take him. I just needed him to know the truth." He held out his hands as the military police officers moved in. "My part in this is done." General Thorne nodded, and Kincaid was finally restrained. The moment he was secured, the base alarm shut off suddenly, leaving the tent wrapped in a heavy, echoing silence. Thorne exhaled, wiping exhaustion from his brow. "Medical teams are on their way. The rest of you stand down." Harold turned to Richards and embraced him. Two old warriors clinging to the impossible truth that they were alive and standing together after believing the other lost. Brewer joined them, his hand gripping both their shoulders, and Harold's granddaughter stepped into the circle, arms wrapped around the man she had just found and almost lost again. The weight of 5 decades lifted from Harold's shoulders as he whispered, "I am not carrying this alone anymore." General Thorne stepped forward, voice solemn. "Sergeant Major Winters, Lieutenant Brewer, Captain Richards. From this day forward, the Marine Corps will ensure your stories are preserved, honored, and never buried again." Harold nodded, his eyes soft but resolute. "Not just mine," he said. "All of them." Reyes looked at Davis, who stood trembling with humility. "You wanted to learn, Corporal? Today you saw what service really means." Davis nodded, his voice cracking. "Yes, Gunny, I will not forget." Harold opened the letter from his son at last, holding it close to his heart. His voice trembled with gratitude, grief, love, and something beautifully painful. "I am going home," he whispered. "For the first time, I am going home." The crowd stood in reverent silence,